Hi there. While we're pulling this in, for anyone who's joining late and wondering what is happening on that screen, we're just using Slido as a way of getting impressions from a number of you. You can see we have 385 people who've joined so far, but a few of the key concerns people might have about the vaccine right now, just to get a sense of where people are at, and lots of different kinds of answers. Some are about things like efficacy and side effects, and some are about timing and prioritization and when people will actually get it. So a lot of issues which we're going to try to address today. I think in the interest of time, that gives us certainly a good visual for some of the things we want to talk about today. I'm going to put on my camera. I just realized it's not on. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll introduce Dr. Bill Sullivan, and we will jump right in. So hi everyone, I'm Yona Lunsky. I direct the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center. This little hour we're spending together today is actually a kind of spin-off of both the family series that we've been holding, working with families of adults with developmental disabilities from across Canada, and also a family webinar series that we'd started last year, where we try to take topics that are relevant to mental health and also relevant to COVID, and have a bit of an interactive discussion. Now, when we said we would have this extra hour on an important topic today, and we picked the date, I think, at one point in December, we thought, probably vaccines is a good one, but we didn't really sort of advertise for it until the end of last week, I think. And we were quite surprised, actually, at how many people have signed up. As I said, there was about 750 people who expressed an interest in coming today, which is a lot. Which also means that the idea of us sort of sitting together, asking a few questions, answering them, having a lot of back and forth is virtually impossible with this many people. We got not only 750 people registering, but about 465 people's questions. And some of you asked more than one question. So what we're going to do with our hour today is sort of give a bit of an overview of some of the issues. And of course, when I say we, it's really my colleague, Dr. Bill Sullivan, who's going to be doing some of that. And then I'll be sort of giving some of the general themes of questions, which he'll answer. And we'll be hearing from a parent in our community as well, who's going to just reflect a bit on what this means for her. And then we'll wrap up. But I just want to say this is the beginning of a conversation. And I think with a lot of healthcare issues, and certainly with this issue of vaccinations at such an intense and difficult time for all of us during this pandemic, it really is a conversation. So it doesn't end today with this hour. It's really just a beginning and an opportunity for us to focus in a little bit on what these things might mean for people with developmental disabilities and for many family caregivers who have a lot of questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bill Sullivan, who is both the sort of lead or head of the developmental disabilities primary care program that is out of Surrey Place, which has fantastic guidelines and tools and resources we will link to for COVID and beyond for adults with developmental disabilities. And he's also a family physician who works out of St. Michael's Hospital here in Toronto. And he has spoken with our families before on some other healthcare issues during COVID, so we thought it would be great to hear from him when it comes to the issue of vaccines. So welcome, Bill. We're glad you're with us, and we can pull up your slides and you can give a little spiel on some of these issues, and then we'll launch off into that to answer some questions.
Thank you very much, Yona. It's really a real delight and privilege for me to be able to address such an important audience. And I'm really also very impressed by the word salads that we just saw. And I guess it just flags, how many issues there are. What I wanted to do is really focus in on kind of some general things first, and then categories of questions that we've seen, and just kind of give some hints about how to go about answering some of these questions, but more broadly, just how to think about this issue of, should I get a vaccination? So I've titled it COVID-19 vaccines for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Is 1 mil of prevention worth it? Next slide, please. So I'll just mention in my disclosures that, as Yona mentioned, I am a practicing family physician. My main focus normally at least academically, is other family physicians caring for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's guidelines and tools and training. But my other hat is I'm actually spend a lot of my time talking to parents and people with intellectual disabilities in a consultation clinic. And when I think that there's parents and siblings, that there's as many as are here right now, that would take me a long time to actually interact with so many people. So that's a real privilege. The other thing I just wanted to say by way of, introduction is that I do not have or never had any financial relationships with companies or industries involved in producing vaccines. And I guess the other thing is that what I try to say, there is some evidence that we can share, but there's also uncertainty. And even that is helpful to know because we're all learning. And in fact, I'm hoping to learn a lot as we kind of dig into some of the issues I'm going to be raising. So next slide. So the title comes from this proverb, and for some reason, I just like proverbs, or at least they come to mind. And the one that comes to mind is, in the old system, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Converting that to the metric system and this issue, we're talking about 1 milliliter, which is 2 doses of these vaccines, pretty much, and whether it's worth it. That's the question. So I think that the issue is people just wish to make a responsible decision about that. And what I want to do is support you as best I can in the time we have together. And we'll try to address as many of the submitted questions, but of course there were over 300. So that's not really going to be possible. But you should also know I'm not a specialist in this area or in everything, and will not be able to address the very particular questions that have to do with circumstances that are so important to these decisions. And I think the recurring message will be, talk about these issues with your family physician and whatever specialist might be involved to get some help with these specific questions. Next slide. So there's going to be 2 parts of this fairly brief presentation overview. And the first is a general approach to making a sound ethical decision. So these are not just clinical or scientific decisions, they are ethical decisions as well. And when I hear a lot of things that people think about, part of the issue is just helping them to kind of think clearly about these issues and kind of keeping the larger context in mind. So there's 3 specific questions about vaccines for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I'm going to address each of these in turn. Next slide. So I've been mentioning this big picture before getting caught up in many details regarding vaccines. So what this is just depicting are the elements of any decision. So there's 4 elements. There's the agent, the person making the decision. There's the goal, what it is that they're hoping for. And there's the ways to that goals, options or means. And there's the broader circumstances that are very variable. So I'm going to keep coming back to this because I think you will find it very helpful as just a basic way of framing this decision. Next slide. So the question is also, who is this agent? In other words, who decides? My experience as well as surveys show that there's fairly high rates of hesitancy to becoming vaccinated by certain people. So it raises the issue of consent, or if that's not possible, at least assent, that is agreeing with a decision about becoming vaccinated. And it's very much like the decision regarding the flu vaccine. Involve the person with the intellectual disability and support in decision making so that they can exercise their capabilities, using that support as needed, especially support regarding the goal. So this image is from a film called The Peanut Butter Falcon, and you can see the character this in the distance is the falcon who has Down syndrome. And in this particular scene, he's indicating his goal. He does not want to go home. And then there's the further issue of kind of accommodating needs. And one need might be a fear of needles, but there's many possible needs. If one is going to perceive that those need to be attended to. Next slide. So again, going back to the big picture, before getting into the details of the vaccine, I guess the question is, how can you make a sound ethical decisions and think about these 4 elements when making those decisions? So the first element is the agent, and I've already mentioned him or that issue just previously. So next slide. So the next thing is the goal. So what is it that we're about? What do we want by this decision? And it could be one or any of these things. These are examples of what that goal might look like. The image, by the way, there's a series of images I'll show, and they just happen to be things that I noticed in bus stations in Toronto that give a message that aligns with some of the things I'll be talking about. So this person's goal, evidently, is I miss my life. I want to get back to, what I enjoyed before. I think this message is one that we can all identify with. Next slide. So if that's the goal, then the question is, what are the ways of getting there? And how do you decide, kind of maybe a technical term is, how do you decide on the means to that goal or options for that goal? And another thing that I'm going to kind of throw in here is that often if in these decisions, you can't have it all. You either go with one or you go with the other. And the saying that captures that is, you can't have your cake and eat it too. So that's why you have to think about these options and decide between them. So next slide. So this is actually, something we talk about is kind of the weighing of options, and there may be several options. I'm only going to talk about 2 for this particular decision. But for each option, there are these elements that one has to think about. So the first is the benefit. And really what that is about is that option going to help promote and achieve your goal? The second would be that, there may be great benefits to this, but are the risks a problem and even acceptable? So there's this issue of kind of the benefits being kind of weighed against the risks and the burdens, like how bothersome is that intervention going to be to you? So the other thing is that there is a relationship between risks and burdens. So often with a risk, there's a way of kind of decreasing that risk that might mean more work. So that actually, because that you've got that risk, you got to do something more. And so that's another sort of trade-off, because maybe the more that you have to do is just too much. So it's just not worth it. And so I just to say you do that with each option. And there's no absolute certainty here. This is a judgment, and it takes some time to think about. But it's helpful to just think about it clearly. So the question is, how will you weigh these benefits, risks, and burdens for each option in light of the goal? So next slide. So this is how I would depict the two options that we're actually, all of us are struggling with at this point when it comes to do with the vaccine. So option A, again, I kind of, you will recognize where this comes from, but you might word this option as stay calm and carry on as best you can. In other words, keep up with the current precautions and ride it out. That's kind of, one option. Another one is roll with the shots. Or in other words, in addition to A, get the available COVID-19 vaccine. And again, just the reminder that each of these has to be assessed in a kind of for its own merits, and then compared. So just to the next slide. So let me just briefly dissect a little bit what it means for option A, kind of just keep up with current precautions. So there's benefits here. There's a reduced risk of exposure to COVID, right? Taking all these precautions will actually lessen the risk. The question is, by how much? And that's a kind of a difficult question we'll get to a bit later. But that's really the point of it all. And the second thing is it's not only risk to yourself, it's also risk to others. And there's this issue of solidarity with others. I mean, there's my good, but there's also the good of others. That's a benefit of doing something. So the next slide. So then that's all good, but there are some risks to think about of this approach. So one is that, people that have been kind of faithfully following these restrictions, their health may well be declining, as well as their well-being. And that may well keep increasing over time. Another risk is that despite your best efforts, you may still be exposed to the virus. And again, that will vary. But that whatever the risk is, even if low, given enough time, it will be significant. And if exposed, there's also the question of how sick you're going to get. Next slide. So the third element of the analysis of option A is the burden of this approach. So there's the risks and the burdens. And this poster, I think, says it all. There's this COVID fatigue that we will all experience, and that will affect behavior and so forth. And then with this option, there is a risk of, despite the precautions, getting infected. So in the study that we're going to be talking about, that of the vaccine, they watched 22,000 people for an interval of time, and quite a few of them actually got COVID. And this was just last summer in different places. So it wasn't even as it doesn't really matter how many people got it, but there were quite a few people that got it. And so some of those people got rather sick, ended up in hospital, etc. And this is what we talk about, the pound of cure. For this, because it wasn't, they tried their best to prevent it, but they got it anyway. And the cure, at a minimum, is 14 days in isolation, plus lots of other things. And then there's also the issue of some of these people ended up in the intensive care unit. Some also died, and that's part of this scenario that we just shouldn't ignore. So next slide. So putting all that aside for a minute, let's look at the other option, and this is kind of roll with the shots. So the benefits for this particular vaccine is actually very impressive. So I told you about the 22,000 people in the study of one vaccine. Of that, so half that group, quite a few people actually became ill. Well, it was 600 and something. But of the people who were vaccinated, there were only 8 in 22,000 when there's this background infectious rate. So among the vaccines, this is, it makes the immunologists giddy. This is an unusual kind of effect of a vaccine. And by comparison to the flu vaccine, most years, it's about at the 50% mark. So it does the job. Some people would almost say that that number was almost zero. I mean, for these, when you got 22,000 people, there's all kinds of things that can happen, but it's almost nobody got COVID. For most, it's safe, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But again, by comparison to the flu vaccine, it is actually safer. There's fewer things in it that are going to cause a problem. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that. And so one of the other benefits of this is that there are the decreased kind of risks associated with being infected that goes along with this as a benefit, really. And there's also this issue of kind of this thing gets over and can I get back to my life? But some of these benefits will depend on how soon people get the vaccine, because it's to prevent an illness. So if you already get the illness, the vaccine's not going to help you too much. That's what prevention's about. So next slide. So then we kind of need to think about the risks. And I don't want to be, getting into really fine detail, but just to say that 99% of people had no problem. 1% described their symptoms as severe, but this was basically a really sore arm for a couple days. It wasn't life-threatening, and it didn't require hospitalization. And then another number is 1 in 100,000 had an allergic reaction. And by this, what I'll talk about a bit more in a moment is anaphylaxis. And those reactions, we've taken, the protocols are set up to be prepared to deal with whenever that happens. And it's basically an EpiPen on site, just to reverse that reaction. And then the other issue is that remains a little unknown is, are there any long-term effects after vaccination? I say unlikely here because, it's only been 6 months now since these trials. But based on other vaccines, really what they're doing is priming the immune system. And typically, the people who are immunologists, specialists in this area, don't really expect there to be anything long-term. Just by way, one other little historical detail is that some people think that this is new, but the basic vaccine technology is actually pretty old. It's actually 225 years old, because it was back in 1797 that Edward Jenner first discovered the the smallpox vaccine. So, I mean, there's a lot of, long-term kind of data on people who have been vaccinated. Next slide. So, burdens. And again, there may be others. Often these burdens have to do with what the particular risks are for the person. So for instance, if somebody has a real problem with needles, then this becomes, to lessen that risk of trauma, there needs to be things done, and that becomes, more complicated and burdensome. Consent will be an issue, and people that are going to resist any are unable to give consent and perhaps have a profound disability and would resist anything that has to do with a needle, they won't be able to show assent, and that's a difficult issue, and would be kind of regarded as a burden to even think about that. And then there might be other contingencies that and adaptations that are in fact going to be a bit of more work to figure out in order for this to be successful. So that's sort of, again, part of the package of this option. So next slide. So again, I think it's important to realize that there's no one right decision for everyone, that one has to consider especially the circumstances that we haven't talked about yet. And often there's going to be details of those circumstances that will require further discussions with family physician, nurse practitioner, specialist, etc. So next slide. So I'm just flagging here the tip of the iceberg of such circumstances, and actually just acknowledging that a lot of the questions we received are about this level of detail. So the person's circumstances, for instance, what kind of accommodations would they need in order to receive a vaccine? The family or other group home or residence circumstances. And part of those circumstances are risks of exposure while waiting for the vaccine and or transmission. And then other things that are listed here. So next slide. So in summary, I would say for most people, for this particular preventive intervention, if one kind of carefully thinks about option A versus option B, and for each thinks about the benefits related to the goals, as well as the risks and the burdens, that I think most people will say that option B here is much better than option A. But one still has to judge circumstances. And there may be many very relevant questions that one needs to have answered in order to make that determination. But I think previously I might have talked about, advance directives, and, you're sick, somebody with a developmental disability has COVID, is sick in hospital, and then the options there. Those things are, for me, questionable of benefit at that point. And yet this is actually, I would say, on a very different level of not being anywhere near that level of question. Again, that's just my view. And I know that there's a lot of people that might feel differently. So next slide. So I thought that I would just kind of open up to some questions, and maybe we can either take the questions now, Yona, if you wish, or I can speak to a few of the things that I thought were the most common ones.
Sure, thanks, Bill. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of summarize the kinds of things we're seeing in the question.
Sure.
It was helpful, I think, hopefully for you as well, and in the audience, those of you we can't see, but we know you're listening, to sort of hear this breakdown of really what happens when we make any decision, but including these kinds of decisions. And one message certainly that I took from it is the importance of, thinking about your own circumstances, weighing these things out and having those conversations or discussions, right? To figure out really what the sort of burdens, the risks and the benefits are, and the circumstances for each person we're thinking about, because people might make different decisions based on all those, things that you highlighted. In terms of the kinds of questions that we heard from everybody, and I want to just thank Irfan Jiwa for helping with this analysis of 465 questions. One of the areas that maybe we'll hint at the end, but also give resources, was kind of like the when. How do we advocate? What's happening? When are the vaccines coming? And I think that's a question that is maybe not so much a question to go to you as the physician who's thinking about, the decisions around vaccine, information about vaccines. So we'll put that sort of on a shelf and give some information, because it also varies. We have people today here from all over the country, and the rollout is going to be a little bit different in each province in terms of who has been prioritized, who's going first, who's going next. So there's some differences. I think the concern families have, and why so many people have come today, is we haven't really seen something clearly articulated that says, if you have a developmental disability, or if you're a family caregiver, an essential caregiver for someone with a developmental disability, here's when you're going to get the vaccine. We haven't heard that information, which is why people are asking. But those decisions happen at a provincial level. So coming back to some of the common questions, that was probably the most common question. But after that, I think, one of the questions has to do with, what about if my son or daughter, brother and sister has this condition or this syndrome? Is it safe? So for Down syndrome, for example, there was a lot of information in the news, especially in the last week, talking about some of the unique risks for people with Down syndrome of COVID. But there's also worries about how someone who maybe has, who's immunocompromised because of Down syndrome and some other things, how the vaccine might affect them. So I wondered, Bill, if you wanted to talk about how you think about those kinds of risks.
Yes. So I guess one of the things that I would say is that the risk for this vaccine, as mentioned earlier, is could be compared to the flu vaccine, and so in that regard, it's actually safer. The other point would be that as far as we know, there is no higher risk for people with developmental disabilities than those in the general population of the vaccine. Now, I said that, but we just might not know that what the risks are yet, because looking at the kind of way that people got into these big studies, there are two big studies of a lot of people. I don't think, and they don't specify, that there were actually people with different disabilities that were represented. There may have been, but it doesn't specify it. So we don't actually know for sure about whether something unusual will happen with the vaccine. One good thing is that that original study is ongoing, and everybody that's getting the vaccine, and there's a lot of people that will be getting it around the world, there will be people with disabilities, and every bad reaction, it's called adverse event following immunization, is being recorded and reported and shared internationally, so that if something like this were to happen, it should kind of come to light fairly soon. I guess the last thing, for one thing, we do know about there is a genetic story that relates to Down syndrome, and on that point, there's two elements. One is just in general, a person with Down syndrome tends not to respond to vaccinations very well. So it's a little bit like an older person. We have high dose flu. That's because they don't, respond as well as a younger person to a vaccine, to a flu shot or other vaccine. That's just a feature of Down syndrome. And it also is common to people that might have other health issues that suppress their immune system. One of the things about that is that this, I suspect, will be also an issue for specialists to help give us guidance. Because, for other vaccines and for this COVID vaccine, there is a way of checking your immune response by a blood test that checks a level of, in this case, an antibody to what's called the spike protein. That is what your immune system is being primed to recognize. And so you can get a level. At this point, we don't actually know quite what that means, what level you need to to indicate that you're protected, but I suspect that'll be something that will be or could be learned. And based on that, it may be that the specialist will have a little bit of different recommendation for people who don't meet that level of protection, such as another booster at some point. I don't know, but it's not to say that because you don't have a good immune system, that's too bad, the vaccine won't work. The other part of the Down syndrome story is a genetic story, and it has to do with this particular type of virus and how it can cause a certain set of events that makes people with Down syndrome, can make people with Down syndrome more ill. And so that's sort of what I think you were referring to. And so to me, it makes it even more important to make sure that they're protected as a matter of priority.
Thanks, Bill. And I guess just to clarify again, when you say that some people, including some people with Down syndrome, may not have as good a response, it's not that they have a bad response as in they have adverse effects. It's more that how quickly they show the immunity might be more like what we see in some older people.
Exactly.
So that's, I think there's a difference, right, between maybe not responding as quickly to it versus having an adverse or a bad reaction. And that's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
The other thing I took out of the discussion is that importance again of the conversation. So for sure, starting with, I would say, your primary care provider, right, to sort of explore some of these issues. But if there are kind of unique things going on in terms of you or your loved ones, health issues, then it may be also having a conversation with a specialist. So whether it's about immune response or another issue that came up is allergies, right? So my loved one has an allergy to, peanuts, to latex, to whatever, or they've had anaphylactic shock before. Is it safe for them to get a vaccine? So how would you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think I kind of referred a bit earlier to this issue of, safety with respect to immune responses. So one response that is like the 1% is like a sore muscle. It's not really, I don't know if it's an immune response, but everybody's going to get a sore muscle, some soreness. That's actually how it works. It has to react. It activates the immune system, and it's working, and you didn't get, just plain water, because there will be some soreness. Actually, younger people will have a little more soreness because they've got a stronger immune response. And the second dose will be a little bit more sore. So that's basically how it works. But the anaphylaxis that we're talking about, that's something like, people that have allergies to bees or peanuts. There's certain things that triggers this overreaction of the immune system, where you get, they call it swelling of the lips and tongue and tight throat, difficulty breathing, and you need an EpiPen really fast. So that doesn't happen, that often, say compared to penicillin, which is 1 in 5,000 doses. People don't realize that. This is 1 in 100,000, but everybody that's providing the vaccine is prepared for this. They've got the epinephrine, they've got the equipment, and you should let them know that this has happened to something or anything else. You have to kind of alert people, and you're supposed to stay everybody's supposed to stay 15 minutes just to make sure it doesn't happen. But if you've had any reaction, you just stay a half an hour. And the other thing is, if that should happen, then that's a contraindication, or you should not get another of these vaccines. Most likely, the substance that you're reacting to in the vaccine, because there's no additives, it's not a live virus, there's no adjuvants, but there is something called polyethylene glycol, which is the same thing that's in a laxative called Restoralax, that many people with developmental disabilities may already be taking. But that would be probably the allergists think that if anybody's going to react to anything, it might be that substance.
Thanks. So we talked a bit about kind of the issue of side effects, or the what ifs of what could happen in terms of the vaccine. There were a lot of questions also that came up, and you sort of hinted at this, Bill, when you talked about some of the burdens, around getting a vaccine. Is it's not easy for any of us, and it's certainly not easy for many people with developmental disabilities to, especially after being in isolation for so long, to go, for example, to a big vaccine center and wait in a long line, wear a mask, and then get a vaccine and sit for 15 minutes while they're waiting to see what happens, right? So what kinds of things can we plan to do and support? I saw one person asked a question about, is there, for example, a numbing agent that can help with the injection site? What kinds of things should we be thinking about? If we think a vaccine is important, but we know that sometimes it's hard to get a flu shot or it's hard to get blood work done.
Very good question. And I think that these are the sort of particulars that, while we can say some general things, that they will often need to be worked out kind of almost on an individual basis. But yeah, there would be, I think it kind of depends on what the need might be. So, if people have a fear, for instance, of needles, then there's preparation that can be done to help desensitize them to that. Unfortunately, all the vaccines are only given by needle. There's none of the drops in the mouth or under the skin, and it's into a muscle. So somebody mentioned the cream. There's an anesthetic cream, one's called EMLA, that can be put on. That's whether that helps that much. You won't feel it on the skin, but you'll feel it in the muscle. But just for the moment, and that it's being injected, it's the same volume as most vaccines, either in the one case 0.3 mils or 0.5 mils. So the volume is not going to hurt any different than, say, the flu vaccine. The other thing is you don't have to use the deltoid muscle. If that's a problem, you can use, for instance, a leg muscle. It's called the quadriceps muscle. Just as good, and for some people that might be helpful. The other thing is, just the way you would prepare for taking blood. There's lots of advice about, practice that, make it something that is not all negative. There may be, options of sort of, negotiating kind of the circumstances, say with your family physician that may at some point be able to give the vaccine, or somebody else who could do it in a preferred environment. They can bring it. We give flu shots at home. You can bring the equipment to make sure if they have a reaction, you can deal with it. So I think that it'll require, one good thing that people aren't getting the vaccine tomorrow is that there's time to think about these kind of circumstances and do some planning, and also help people to kind of be able to, as much as possible, kind of go through the line and get the shot. And if that's just not possible, kind of thinking about alternatives.
Thanks. I mean, I think what I'm hearing again there is that same message about having those conversations and doing that planning. It does kind of suck that we can't all get the vaccine tomorrow if we wanted it. There's a wait. But in that wait, there's an opportunity to think through these things and to involve, if you're a family member watching this, to involve the person you love with a developmental disability as much as possible, in terms of preparing and thinking and making this decision and having those conversations with your healthcare provider to think about accommodations. And even though we've never had this vaccine before, we have had flu shots for a long time. We've had blood work for a long time. So there's other kinds of examples that you can think about now that have worked well or that haven't worked well, and you can sort of take apart, like, why didn't it work, or what made this one go really well, and then seeing how to help create that. And I think that also comes back to some of the advocacy we need to be doing, because it's not just about making sure that we remember the importance of people with developmental disabilities and family caregivers getting vaccinated, but also how people get vaccinated in a way that's, safe and adapted for them. So really making sure that everybody understands, I think, across the country, what it will take to do safe vaccine administration that's not traumatizing for people.
Exactly.
And that goes well, right? So I wonder, so we have some more, I mean, again, there's so many questions. I don't think we're doing justice by picking one person's example or one person's question. I think that main feedback about having these conversations now is really important. We're going to put into the chat box some resources that we think are helpful. There's a lot of general resources out there trying to make it easier to understand information about vaccines that fit with a lot of the questions people have asked. So we'll share some of those. We'll share as well some information about explaining vaccines with photos to people with developmental disabilities. And we'll also share a really nice guide that was developed in the UK about, how you can sort of make adaptations, or some of the things you were talking about if someone is kind of scared of needles or doesn't like to have vaccines, different things to think about or explore. And hopefully those things will be useful. But I thought it might be really nice if we would be able to actually, I'm thinking about this, I guess, both as someone who works in healthcare and studies healthcare, but also as a family member of someone with a developmental disability who, I really hope that it's an option for her at some point to get this vaccine. But I thought it would be good to listen to another family member, and especially in talking about Down syndrome, because that's something we've heard so much about in the media. And there's a lot of attention to the vulnerabilities in that group. So I wanted to invite Inez, who's a family member who's worked with us and who sort of flagged these issues in the community, to just sort of comment a bit on what it means hearing this talk and some things you've been thinking about that other people might just one view. We can't capture everyone's views, but I wanted to make sure that we gave a floor to a parent and not just to Bill or to myself. So I'm going to go on mute and welcome Inez. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
No, thank you so much, Jonah and Dr. Sullivan, for having organized this for families. I think representing the voices of families, as you say, is really hard, because we are so many families with so diverse needs and with so diverse challenges. But I think that what you are giving us today is very valuable in the sense that we need to prepare. And preparation is so crucial, because we have the time right now to prepare to the vaccine rollouts. None of us have gotten the vaccine yet. So I think that planning makes a huge difference. And it's an informed planning. I think that's so important for families, because families are the most valuable resource and support for many individuals with intellectual disability or developmental over the lifespan. So with the COVID, families have become teachers, trainers, innovators, providers of support of individual technology, so much more. We have managed to keep our family member engaged, healthy, safe, in good mental health, which is a huge concern for anyone, for them. So once again, we are here called as family members to sort of say, support the individual in making their choice and decisions about the vaccine. And that's supported decision making, and it's a huge topic because of the diversity of the challenges that people face. But I think if we as a family have more information, we can support that decision, and we are prepared to support choices and decisions when vaccines roll out. So that's one part that I find it very valuable in all these resources that have been coming out. The other one that is more worrisome in my personal perspective, and my son has Down syndrome, is the information that has been rolling out about Down syndrome. Because we as a family, I know the challenges that my son will have if he gets infected with COVID. If he gets to go to the hospital, if he gets to go to an ICU unit, he cannot have me as a support. And so my worries right now, and my biggest worrisome, is that it's not rolling up on for Julian to be prevented from getting COVID. And so before, there was no other choice. He had the same risk as anyone of getting it, But now there is a choice that the vaccines roll a bit faster. And it has been surprising that people with this intellectual disability haven't been in the priority list of the phase 2 at least. So we were hoping, and many families were hoping, that the decision on vaccines were already made, but that we needed it to be rolled out. So it's been disappointing. But I know that Yona has been doing some work. The Canadian Down syndrome is sort of doing, we've seen it in the news, that there's some work that needs to be done for these people to be prioritized in a second phase. And I think that's the message that we as families should give you all is, we hear all these messages, we are here, just tell us what you need us as families to do in an advocacy effort for the vaccines to roll a bit faster and prioritize our family members.
Good. Could I say a word, Yona? So thank you very much. Those were excellent reflections, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I guess I'm kind of worried about people not, kind of dismissing this ounce of prevention for reasons that aren't, I would say, really weighty. But the big issue really is the fact that people with that are at high risk of, mortality are not being prioritized. And that is an advocacy issue. I'm no expert at this, but one thing that I would refer you to is that there is an international debate about this, and something that was published just recently in the British Medical Journal, very prestigious journal, January 14th, 2021, by Lodge, Brown, and Hollins. And it's people with an intellectual disability should be prioritized for vaccination. So just have a look at that. And, they point out, and we know that for a certain age group of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that they've studied, age 18 to 34, mortality rate was an astounding 30 times higher. And the overall mortality rate for everybody that were studied compared to their same age peers was 6 times greater. And so the other interesting thing about that advocacy way of framing the issue is that they're sort of saying that it should be everybody with intellectual disabilities, not splitting. So again, I'm no expert at this, but it's something to think about. And part of the reason is that it's not just mortality that we're talking about. It's what we call morbidity of being in this phase going on for more than a year with, no early end in sight. So advocacy is, I think, the key issue.
Thank you so much, Bill and Inez. Thank you so much for those really from the heart comments. I think we all can play a role in educating ourselves, our loved ones, and the public, whether it's educating your own healthcare provider about some of the resources we've been sharing that they may not know about if they don't, specialize in this area, or, sharing information with people in government, with people we know. There is information to share, and we can all play a role in that. We have written some documents about this. As you can see in the chat box, Heidi's linked to the most recent piece, and I should say there were 2 family members connected to writing that piece. So sometimes people in health who are advocating wear more than one hat, and I think that's important. And I think every voice counts, and so let's keep educating each other, let's keep connecting with each other. We will send, as Tiz highlighted, a recording of the webinar will be available on our YouTube website, and we'll share that information so people can follow along and stay updated, because with new, every month, every week that passes, we have new data. We have new data. Someone asked about what's happening with the vaccine and longer term side effects. We'll know about those things over time. We'll know more about hopefully what's going on here in Canada, and we can share that information too. And the one last question I just want to address is someone said, can you make sure that people know what our questions are? And that is something that we'll also commit to doing. So not just trying to help continuing to answer some of your questions as best we can, but making sure that other people are aware of just how many families have questions and what the key questions are. Because in terms of health communication, we need to make sure we're communicating, information about what people want to know about. And also just to add, if you have a developmental disability yourself and you're here today, or you're a family member and you wish there was something there for your loved one to hear or listen to, those easy read documents we developed with people with developmental disabilities, and we're working with them to be planning similar kinds of webinar information events. And so you'll be getting information on when those events will be. We'll be doing some work with People First Canada, and we're also doing some work just amongst ourselves. And so we'll keep sharing that information. So thank you everyone for attending. It is 2 o'clock. Thank you, Inez, for your comments. Thank you, Bill Sullivan, for putting together this talk and beginning to answer these questions. And thanks to all of you for sticking with this stuff during the pandemic and continuing to learn and continuing to hope and continuing to advocate. And may we all continue to stay safe and well and build this community so we're all working on this together.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Thank you very much.